Welcome to the CTDL Rubrics Terms Proposal webinar. I'm Jeanne Kitchens, Chief Technology Services Officer with Credential Engine, and I am joined by Nate Argo, Associate Solutions Architect, and Phil Barker, CTDL Consultant to Credential Engine. And behind the scenes, we also have Cadence Calexto, part of our publishing team, helping us with the webinar today. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining. The webinar is being recorded. The recording and all of the materials that we'll use with today's webinar will be available to everyone following the second webinar, which is later on this afternoon. Our topics today are an introduction to the CTDL update process, an overview of the rubrics task group, a review of the CTDL rubric domain model, an overview of rubric examples and what we call RDF Triple Diagrams, and finally, an introduction to the terms proposal for your feedback, and we'll cover how to provide feedback and next steps. Before we get into those topics, for those of you who may be new to Credential Engine, we are a nonprofit organization with a mission to map the credential landscape for credential transparency. And we do this through a variety of programs, deep and lasting collaborations and partnerships, and also through technologies that we build, maintain for converting information into CTDL linked data structure. Foundational to our work at Credential Engine is the Credential Transparency Description language. Our rubrics term proposal expands on that language. We also develop and provide a whole suite of publishing tools, and those tools are for publishing CTDL linked open data structure to the Credential Registry and to the open web. The data in the Credential Registry is available for others to use with their systems, web applications, mobile applications, etc. The CTDL is a very large language, and we're getting ready to expand it further with rubric data. And what you're seeing here is an image giving you a great idea of the depth and breadth of the CTDL, with each of the images representing what we call a class in the CTDL, and the arrows being notional, representing how all that data can link together to provide important and helpful and transparent information to people and for machine readable data. The CTDL is composed of three schemas that are fully integrated and work together. And today we're going to be talking about the CTDL schema and the CTDL ASN. We have a structured process for updating the credential transparency description language. This information is available from our websites, and that links to this information can be shared in the chat and will be made available following this meeting. What you're seeing here are relationships between the staff at Credential Engine, consultants with Credential Engine, various advisory groups, and how we intersect with what we call task groups. And what we're going to look at today is a result of the rubrics task group work. The process that we use has been refined over several years now. The process is very important because we want to ensure orderly changes that support and expand durable and persistent value of CTDL linked open data. So we have refined this process, and we're going to learn a little bit more about this process in respect to the rubrics task group. When we convene a task group, we have a set of activities that end up becoming deliverables. So we're very outcome oriented when we form a task group. So far, we have a 100% success rate with our task groups, leading to completing all of the planned activities and related deliverables. And you're about to see what those deliverables were from the rubrics task group. We carry out these activities and create these deliverables through a series of typically 6 meetings, although more can be added if necessary, where between meetings, task group members contribute and give feedback throughout the process. So let's take a look at the rubrics task group. That task group had a broad range of 42 subject matter experts. It started on June 14th of this year, concluded on August 23rd of this year, was held over 6 meetings, and the outcome was we had completed all of the scoped activities and deliverables. This is a listing of the rubrics task group members. If any of those members have joined this webinar today, we give our thanks to all of them. They play a vital role in providing use cases, examples, and feedback throughout the process that will continue with this webinar and through another 2 weeks beyond this webinar as well. And you can see this is a broad range of subject matter experts representing many different organizations with interest in rubrics. The first thing that this task group did was create and approve a charter. So all of our task groups always have a charter. Those charters identify the scoping for the work to be done by the task group, as well as what is out of scope. And what you're seeing here is an excerpt from that charter identifying what the task group will do, and basically explaining the importance of rubrics and how they link together learning and working through evaluation of criteria for things like work and performance. The next thing that the task group did after approving a charter was to begin providing examples of rubrics, a very broad range of examples and use cases for rubrics. And it was very important for the scoping of the rubrics task group that we did not leave rubrics out across these broad ranges. We had many types of examples of rubrics, for example, ranging from evaluating grant proposals to learning evaluation, to occupational and job task and performance evaluation. It was very important to have a very broad range of rubrics for this work. So they were across many scopes, types, domains, purposes, audiences, users, and criteria for evaluating whatever it is that those rubrics were designed to evaluate, such as job tasks or learning outcomes, for example. So it was really important to have this very broad range of rubric examples provided by the task group. And Nate, when he gets into talking about the domain model, he's going to talk about how he did the deep dive process for doing the analysis of those rubric examples. But to give you an idea of the types of rubrics, and this is a small subset of the rubrics that we looked at. There were many other rubrics that we looked at, but you can see here that rubrics can have many different purposes, many different formats and structures, and a broad array were looked at, both rubrics that might be delivered online through like a learning management system and maybe evaluated through some kind of an algorithm, versus rubrics that are done by hand by a person or maybe a group of people. So this gives you an idea of, again, of that broad range of rubrics that we looked at, but this is just a subset of the rubrics. We documented numerous use cases provided by the task group members, as well as examples of the rubrics. In many of our meetings, we spent quite a bit of time going through various types of rubrics, their contexts, and their structure and criteria. So that is an overview of the rubrics task group. And this is a listing of the deliverables that came out of that task group. We did complete everything that we set out to do, including documenting use cases and examples, as I just explained. The process also involves developing models, encoded examples of the models, a terms proposal, marked up examples of rubrics, and a mapping of rubric standards or schemas through a tool called the Data Ecosystem Schema Mapper tool. Today, we're going to focus on the models that came out of that work, the terms proposal, and the examples with what we call triple RDF triple examples. And I'm going to turn it over to Nate Argo to talk about the resultant CTDL rubric domain model.
All right. So as Jeannie got into there, our process is sort of summarized on this slide. We do iterate, as we see on the bottom right there, so we go through this whole thing a few different times with each sort of variation or iteration, I guess, of the model. So what we started with was we took the use cases that we had, we analyzed those, we went through and said, okay, what are the pieces and parts that make these use cases work? Who are these serving? What are the purposes of them? We took the example rubrics. We had, I think, something like 24-ish rubrics, a bunch of different kinds, as Jeannie outlined. We said, okay, what are the pieces and parts of these? How do they work together? We got to cheat a little bit on that one because there are other schemas that already have identified how rubrics works. We were able to base some of our work on those, and I think Phil will touch on that a little bit later. But anyway, so we took those that part of the process. We built out our own modeling. As part of that, we have diagrams. There are a few different types of diagrams. I'm going to go over one of them here in a second. Phil's going to go over a different type. Then we said, okay, based on all of this work, what does the actual CTDL schema, the JSON-LD, the data, if you will, the machine readable part of it, what does that look like? We basically took our work through those examples at it, said, okay, what works, what doesn't, where are the gaps, how do we address that, and we iterated again. So that process we repeated a few times throughout this. And so one of the types of models we built is what's called a domain model. We have two different ones of these we're going to look at. This one is the simplified one. So this is based on the rubric domain models that came from the other schemas that we sort of borrowed ideas from. It focuses on just the new parts here. So we have the rubric class in the upper right, or the upper left, sorry, that identifies the rubric itself. That's where a lot of the connections to things like credentials and assessments and whatnot will go into, and we'll see that more on the next diagram. We have the rubric criterion in the center here. That is usually represented along sort of the vertical axis on the left of most of the common rubrics. The rubric criterion at more of a semantic or data level are basically here are the criteria for this rubric. The criterion level, you can think of those as being sort of the cells in the table. Sometimes those have descriptive pieces of text with them, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're just where you write in the scoring. But the criterion level is essentially different levels, if you will, of achievement on those criterion. And to better document those levels of achievement, something that where we kind of diverge a little bit from the way some of the other schemas work, is we have the rubric level class. You can think of this as sort of the y-axis on your typical rubric. So rubric level defines here's a level of achievement. Maybe you did well, maybe you did poorly, maybe you did somewhere in the middle, that kind of thing. And then the two boxes on the lower left there are something that we noticed showed up in some of the other models, not all of them. Essentially, those serve to just allow you to group the rubric criterion together under categories, sort of a very simple hierarchy, if you will. Next slide. So what this looks like in sort of the greater context of CTDL is something like this. So we obviously the three classes in the middle, or four classes in the middle here, have their own properties. We haven't listed all of them out just for the sake of brevity here. We wanted to focus more on the connections to other things. So you'll notice throughout this diagram that there are the items across the top that represent sort of the main classes, if you will, in CTDL. So those are your credentials, your learning opportunities, including courses, learning programs, the assessment profiles, which come into play a lot with rubrics because often there's an assessment paired with a rubric. So those are the things that are going to be using rubrics, and then we have these connections out on the left and right of the rubric classes to better describe what that rubric applies to. So things like the industry type, the occupations, various audiences or education levels, things like that. Occupation is one where we had a little bit more focus this time around, and again, I think Phil can go into that. We have a few new concept schemes. Mostly we're reusing existing concept schemes. We do have at least one new one to indicate the evaluator type for the rubric, and I believe that is on the right there. There are also connections down in sort of the lower right area to tasks and competencies, because very often rubrics will be sort of directly tied to, or rubric criteria, I should say, will be directly tied to a given task or set of tasks or competency, set of competencies, that kind of thing. Any questions on any of that?
Hey, Nate, the other thing to mention is the
Yeah.
color coding. The kind of orangey gold peachy color means new. And all the other black and white boxes and text in those boxes are existing CTDL classes and properties. So you can see here in this modeling that we take advantage of the existing CTDL and can add a small number of properties to make a big change.
Yep.
Okay, anything else on the models?
I don't believe so. So I think,
Okay.
Phil, if you're going to take it from here.
Yeah, I'm going to go into more detail for how we modeled some of those examples that Jeanne showed earlier. And I'm going to do so through the medium of what we call RDF Triple Diagrams. And these are a way of representing RDF data, which we hope is, and we've found, is reasonably well understandable for non-technical audiences. In RDF, descriptions are composed of statements. Each statement has got three parts, hence we call them triples. Those three parts are the subject, the thing that's being described, the predicate, which is a specific property as a part of that description. It's identifies a characteristic of the thing that's being described or a type of relationship to some other thing. And the object, which you can think of as being the value of the property. It may be a textual value of a characteristic, for example, the age or the date at which something becomes effective, or it may be a related resource. So it may relate one object to another object. And that's the sort of relationship that you see in the diagram on this slide, where we're saying that a credential organization offers a credential in the first triple one. And then we go on to make the object of that first statement the subject of another statement. So that the credential requires some competency. And that's a second statement, a second triple. And triples can be linked you in this way, and you can have many triples about the same subject. The object of one triple can be the subject of another triple. So they link together to build a big web or a graph of linked data. And it's those diagrams of those graphs that I'm going to be showing you for some of the examples that we looked at. On the next slide is the first example, which represents, if you like, the most typical form of rubric that we came across. Many of our examples were in exactly this form, and we found that the other examples could be conceptualized in this way, in ways that I'll discuss later. This is what's called by people who use rubrics an analytic rubric. So it breaks the rubric down into 7 criteria. And for each criteria, it identifies a level of performance. So you've got the criteria going down marked in green, and you've got the rubric levels, excellent, proficient, satisfactory, unsatisfactory, going across. And then where a criterion meets a level, where you're indicating that somebody is performing a particular criteria to a particular level, that's a criterion level. This is fairly easy to analyze. It's quite straightforward. What's not so straightforward is showing the result of that analysis in a diagram. So if we go on to the next slide, you'll see my best attempt at doing this. You'll see there's the rubric circled in green. In these diagrams, we normally circle the starting point of the description, if you like, in green. And it's showing that that rubric has got 4 rubric levels going across the top in those arches. There are also 4 rubric criteria, although I could only show 2 of them. You'll have to imagine this continuing off the bottom of Jeanne's screen. And for each of those criteria and levels, we have text that was on the row and column headings in the original diagram, and data. So we've got the names of those levels: excellent, proficient, satisfactory, and excellent again for some reason. I shall fix that. I think it should be unsatisfactory, the last one there. And for each of the criteria, we've got the name of that criterion, and we've got the weight that is accorded to it in the rubric, because sometimes some criteria are more important than others. What I found harder to represent is that each of those criteria is linked with has CriterionLevel to all 4 of the criteria. So you've got to imagine these arrows as sort of extending from the rubric criterion on the left across and underneath the icons that represent the other criterion levels that get in the way. Likewise, each rubric level is associated with a criterion level going down. And so, you know, you can represent this this graph in a grid format that looks very similar to the the original rubric. And that hopefully orientates you around the main classes that we have for rubrics. The main rubric class, the rubric levels, the rubric criterion, and the criterion level classes. On the next slide, I go into a little bit more detail about what you can say for a criterion level. And, you know, apologies for the previous slide if you weren't able to see all of the text. Hopefully you could see the overview. I couldn't even fit all of the text onto the slide, let alone have it legible. This fills in some of those gaps. So in particular, it shows that at each criterion level, which is, as I said before, where a rubric criterion meets a rubric level, you have the text, which is the benchmark text that describes the performance that you would expect to see for somebody who is performing for this criterion at the level, at the relevant level, and also the percentage, in this case, that's awarded for performance at that level. And the way QData percentage works is that if the percentage is 1.0, that means they've scored 100%. So those are the building blocks that we use for all of the examples that we looked at. The next, we had variations on these examples. So the next slide shows something that at first looks very similar. But when you actually look at it in detail, you'll see that, let's look at going across the top, you'll see that although there are 5 columns, there are in fact only 3 headings for those columns. There are only 3 levels, but the criteria levels, you get 2 criterion levels under one of the rubric levels. That's right, yeah. And also, if you look closely, hopefully you can just make out the text, you'll see that the description of the criterion levels, the benchmark statements, which fill in the cells of this table, are in fact the same for each criterion. And what that means when we're modeling this in data, we can reuse those criterion level and the benchmark statements against all of the different criteria. So if you look on the next slide, you get a view of what that works out overall. And again, apologies, you cannot see the text on this. You'll have to, take my word and hopefully understand that it is the same text that was in those boxes. But what I hope it shows is the overall shape of the data and the fact that we are reusing the same criterion levels for each of the rubric criteria. So each of the 3 criteria going down link to the same criterion levels. And those criterion levels are also shared between rubric levels. So that mimics the way the column headings spanned over 2 columns that had different benchmark statements. So the rubric level at the end there that Jeanne is indicating now links down acts as a heading for two different criterion levels. So we get a fair amount of sharing and reusing data in this way. The next example builds on the previous one, and all that's changed here is that whereas before the rubric criteria were blank, you know, they essentially said nothing, they are referenced to competencies from a competency framework, circled in green here. And we can show that by linking the rubric criteria to competencies that we have modeled in CTDL, and that's shown on the next diagram. So I'm just showing the leftmost part of the previous diagram, and I am adding to that a link from the rubric criterion to a target competence. So the rubric criterion is in green. There's an arc going off to the left to a competence statement, which gives the full description of the competency, and also it shows that that competency statement and the competency statements for the others, other criteria, are all part of a competency framework. And you know, you can hopefully imagine how, you know, that competency framework might be referenced to or by a job or by a course as a set of learning objectives, which I think is where this example came from, or to a credential as the set of requirements for a credential. So you begin to see how, as Nate showed in the bigger diagram, you know, the bigger domain model diagram, how we link rubrics and rubric criteria into the rest of CTDL and all of the data that can be expressed in CTDL. The next example that we looked at, again, is it's similar in that it breaks down the rubric into sets of criteria, but it introduces two things. First of all, there's only a single point for each of these criteria. Don't get misled by the fact that the example that we were given of this allows the same form to be used for many people. For each person, against each criterion, they are assigned a level of go or no go. So that's a binary yes/no status. The other thing to mention is that the criteria here are arranged thematically. See, communicate, navigate. And that's a way of classifying the criteria. And we can look at the triples diagram for this on the next slide. Again, you see how much reuse we get of criterion levels. In this case, everything references the one criterion level that has, again, you can't see it, it's that lone dot down at the sort of bottom right, center right, and all that's saying is that it is a binary evaluation, that it can hold one of the two values of the rubric levels that it's referenced by. The other thing that we have on this diagram is each rubric criterion references or has a criterion category, which are the concepts. We use concepts from concept schemes to categorize things such as rubric criteria. And the first one is the concept of C. It's got the preferred label of C. The next one down has communicate. Is the concept for communicate. And the next two are navigate, if I recall correctly. Yeah, navigate. So that's showing how we can use the existing mechanism for classifying things using CTDL to classify criteria as they're classified on a in a rubric. Now the next example is a different type of rubric altogether. It's what's known as a holistic rubric rather than an analytic rubric. And here, rather than breaking the rubric down into criteria, there's just an overall score for the task as a whole. This example comes from preparing breakfast in bed. It is from a website called Cult of Pedagogy. And the key to understanding how we model this is to treat it as if there's just the one criterion. And you can imagine what the description of that criterion might be. How good was breakfast in bed? But it's one criterion that covers the whole of what the rubric is evaluating. And then realize that the rubric here is displayed rotated 90 degrees from how the others have been rotated. So the levels, which we've seen along the top of the other rubrics, are actually down the side of this rubric. And there is only the one row. There's only the one row which is outlined in pink in this example. And if we model it that way, we get the triple diagram in the next slide. And again, wasn't able to fit all of this on. Hopefully I've, it's the same pattern that repeats. But you see the one rubric criterion linking out to criterion levels. The criterion levels have got all of the data in that's required. So the first level there corresponds to all the food being perfect, everything being perfect. They get a score of 4. The second criterion level there is food is cooked perfectly, presented in a clean way, organized manner. Recipient is comfortable. And that gets a value of 3. So by using just criterion level and a single rubric criterion, we're able to model holistic rubrics using the same classes that we used to model diagnostic rubrics. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So far, I've focused on conveying the data that is inside the rubric itself. But as well as that, we found a lot of cases that there was metadata or just general data about the rubric as a whole. These include things like the association of a rubric with a credential, assessment, learning opportunity, job, task, or competency framework. The information about how a rubric is intended to be used. Some of the rubrics were intended for self-assessment. Some rubrics were intended for peer assessment, by a group of peers. Some were intended by assessment by an external marker, and so on. And we have a vocabulary that attempts to codify these different types of users, which is one of the things we'd like you to look at in the proposal. There's also information about how the results should be calculated from the scores for each criterion. It's not always as simple as adding up all of the individual scores for each criterion and get the overall score. Sometimes there's weighting involved. Sometimes a pass has to be, a passable mark has to be achieved in 5 out of 6 of the criteria. Sometimes the algorithm is quite complicated to allow for facts that the minimum score is 1 by the rubric. There's also things about the rubric that need to be said, such as the target audience, the target industry, the occupation for the rubric. You know, a rubric, one example we had was designed for the oil industry. And so, you know, that's something that we want to be able to record. And finally, quite importantly, you know, these rubrics are somebody's intellectual property. They've been created by somebody. That often has to be acknowledged. So I'll show a couple of examples of that type of data. The first example is for a job appraisal. You know, it's important to remember that rubrics are not just used for academic use. This is a rubric that's used in a job appraisal. It is created by an organization called Station X, and they are offering a job as an analyst, and this rubric is used to appraise people for that job. You know, it might be appraising applicants for that job, or it might be used for progression within the job. And that job is associated with an occupation of code breaker. And you see, you know, that they've chosen, or that they're indicating that this rubric is useful for the occupation of code breaker as a whole. There's a progression level associated with the rubric down at the bottom, where it says that this rubric is at the level of trainees, because we found examples where different rubrics were used for people who were new to a job than were used for people who had been 5 years in post. And finally, there's the administration process, which gives a scoring method description. It says, in this case, for a pass, a score of 5 or higher must be attained on at least 6 of the criteria. So that's one example of metadata about a rubric as a whole. The next slide shows example of metadata for an academic rubric. So this time it's created by a credential organization, which is an organization that's involved in giving out credentials. And it's used by the Physics 101 course, which is offered by that organization. So that course has a rubric. And here what I wanted to highlight was the evaluator type. It's this concept scheme that we have for different types of evaluators. And in this case, it's peer evaluation. So the person who'd be using this rubric for evaluation is the peer of the person who's being evaluated. In this context, that would be another student. And we're showing here the property has scope, which is that this rubric is intended for group revision exercise. So that explains somewhat why it's why a peer evaluation is appropriate in this case. So hopefully that's given you an overview of what we cover in this proposal, and how what we cover relates to the examples that we were provided. And I don't know if any questions have come up. I see Nate has made some comments in the. Good.
I haven't seen any questions, no.
No. Happy to answer questions if there are any. Otherwise, I hand over to Jeanne now.
All right. So the domain model and the examples that Phil went over all come to fruition with this terms proposal. The terms proposal that I'm going to go over with you is in direct alignment with the models, the pictures that Nate showed, and with the examples that Phil went over. And what we're asking for after this webinar is for your feedback on this proposal. This proposal also includes what we call the Credential Registry Minimum Data Policy. Now, the CTDL is something completely outside of the Credential Registry. However, all of the data that gets published to the Credential Engine's Credential Registry is CTDL. So at the same time that we do these terms proposals, we include the minimum data, the proposed minimum data policy with that proposal as well. And you'll see that when you take a look at the terms proposal, And you'll see that the minimum data policy is identified as three defined categories. What is required, meaning that data about a rubric would have to be included to be published to the Credential Registry. A recommended benchmark, and that is a best practice. You don't have to include the data, but it is recommended as a best practice. And then optional, and that means all the other terms that are available. In this case, for describing the rubric classes that Nate and Phil went over, are optional for publishing to the registry. I'm going to show you a breakdown of the terms proposal, and that begins with what we call the rubric classes. And Nate showed you those in the diagrams. They were in the gold boxes in the diagrams, and the labels align to those boxes that Nate showed you. So we are introducing 4 new classes to the Credential Transparency Description language, and every term in the CTDL has a definition. Every term without exception is defined. So what we're asking you to look at are the labels and the definitions for these classes. And as well, you might have feedback on including a comment. So these are our proposed definitions that came out of the rubric task group. And we're not going to read all of the terms and definitions in this webinar. We're going to ask you to take a look at the terms proposal and read those definitions and provide your feedback on them. Now, of course, this label for rubric and this definition is foundational to the entire proposal because our entire proposal is about describing the structure, the components, the uses, and so forth, the users of the rubric. So I'll read that definition, but I'm not going to read all of these. I have more slides to go over. Rubric, a structured and systematic evaluation tool used to assess performance, quality, and or criteria. What you're going to notice about this definition and the other definitions that relate to the rubric classes is we don't use the word person or individual in those definitions because, as we pointed out earlier, we have examples of rubrics that are not only used for evaluating a person in a job or learning or other type of setting, but it could be other things like maybe the evaluation of an outcome or of a work like a grant proposal. The next section of the terms proposal are properties, and the properties are for describing the classes in. Phil just showed you in his triple diagrams how those descriptions are used in the CTDL. And what you're going to see in the properties section is that there's going to be columns. There's a heading just above the columns to explain what each column is for. The columns that we are asking you to focus on have a gold highlight here. That's the label, definition, comment, and usage note for the new proposed rubric related term. And then you're also going to see in the terms proposal, there's some green highlighted cells. And those are where we have existing CTDL terms that we propose to modify. And we're going to modify them. We're always going to be broadening the definition of that term. So we do not have to deprecate it. Instead, we can broaden it to include rubrics as well as other CTDL resources. So this introduces the properties section of the proposal. And when you look at the proposal in the Google Doc, and I'll pull that up after I go through these slides, you're going to see the rows, as I indicated, that will be highlighted in the kind of gold color. Those are the new proposed terms. You're going to see that they're organized by class, and they're in alphabetical order by what we call the label, and that's the human readable label for the machine readable data, and the definition and the comment. So what we want you to do is look at this gold colored highlighted rows that you're going to see throughout the proposal. And if you have any comments or suggestions for the label, definition, comment, or usage note, you can include those comments. So that is the properties section. And this slide shows the remainder of the proposed new properties. And you can see they're organized. So these are criterion level properties. Again, there's a label definition and comment for you to look at and provide your feedback on. And that's followed by the last section of the proposal, which is the concept scheme. And Phil in particular touched on this new concept scheme over his last example called evaluator category. And a concept scheme is a structured and predefined set of related terms. That's very useful for things like if you go online, for example, and you have a pick list, a standardized pick list to choose from. They're great for searching filters, for example. And as I said, predefined selection lists are a great example. So in the CTDL, we support concept schemes, and we're introducing a new concept scheme called evaluator category. We can see the label and the proposed definition. And as Phil pointed out, this is to identify the user of the rubric who performs, in this case, the evaluation. And finally, that is followed by the concepts in that concept scheme. So those concepts are the controlled vocabulary. They're in a table format. They're color coded to indicate all of the new concepts in the kind of gold color. And you should look at those and provide your feedback again on the labels, definitions, comment, and usage notes. And this is the listing of the proposed concepts for the evaluator category concept scheme. And you can see the label, the definition, and the comment. And again, I'm going to open up a Google document so we can take a quick look at that so we can see what those look like. Let me jump over to that document. We'll drop this in the chat. And this is the complete proposal. You can see it has a table of contents. It begins with an update of the tracking of changes that have made during the rubrics and following the rubrics task group. And it's organized in the table format that I just showed you. The new proposed terms are highlighted in the gold color, and you can use commenting in this Google document to add a comment by simply highlighting text and then clicking the comment and putting your comment in on whatever changes or questions you have about the proposal. So these are the proposed classes. That's followed by the properties table. And you'll see it's organized by the classes, beginning with rubric. The properties are then listed in alphabetical order. And as I noted, the kind of blue-green color means we're modifying an existing CTDL term, and that's going to be because we need to broaden the definition to include rubric. And further down, so you're going to see a lot of existing CTDL terms that we can reuse. We don't need any comments necessarily on those terms. And we can come down and scroll down and further on. We're going to see below the rubrics class. So these are all the rubric class. Again, the properties are in alphabetical order. Here's some proposed for you to comment on. And below the rubric, you can see this is a large proposal here. We have rubric criterion, CriterionLevel. So those are the classes. And again, you're looking for what are the new terms we're introducing in the CTDL. As we noted earlier in the presentation, we reuse existing terms so we can get a lot done with a number of terms added to the CTDL. So you're looking for the gold terms in particular. Those are the properties, followed by the concept scheme. We're introducing one new concept scheme called evaluator category. There's the definition. And below that, finally, are the concepts for that concept scheme, and you can comment on it. And that is the bottom. We have reached the end of the proposal. So this is one of the ways that you can provide direct feedback. It's the easiest way to read through, I think, all of the proposed terms and see the context for using existing terms. Do we have any questions? No questions? Okay. So the next steps are to review the terms proposal and provide feedback on the yellow/gold highlighted rows, as I pointed out. And you have options for doing this. You can use commenting directly in the Google document. We also use GitHub. There's a GitHub issue, and there are all kinds of examples, JSON LD examples, an entire terms proposal in there as well, where you can comment directly in GitHub issue number 892, or you can send an email to info@credentialengine.org. Provide your comments by Friday, September 22nd, 2023. Now, while you're doing that, we are ready behind the scenes to do additional work. So when we add CTDL terms, we have to do things like update the CTDL handbook. We have to update the Credential Registry minimum data policy. We have to update our Credential Registry Publishing Assistant API guide. We have to update our Credential Registry publishing system to support publishing rubrics to the Credential Registry. We have to update the Credential Finder and the Credential Registry consuming options. So while we're receiving comments behind the scenes, we're ready to make these kinds of updates. Those are our next steps. As we noted, with our process for expanding the CTDL, we have a defined process. Information about that process is available on the public Credential Engine technical website. And we are getting ready to form another task group. This will be our final task group for 2023 as part of our annual plan of work. It's a CTDL certificates task group. If you or any of your colleagues are interested in joining this group, the information is available for you, and there's an online forum where you can join the task group. And that is the end of our presentation today. As we noted at the beginning of the webinar, it is being recorded. The materials and the recording will be sent out to everyone who registered for this webinar and made available as public information through Credential Engine websites. Does anybody have any closing comments or questions? No. All right. If not, we will go ahead and conclude this webinar. Again, thank you for joining and having a fantastic day.